when we talk about like this concept of tonic masculinity or non-toxic masculinity, that man is embodied. That person is, in touch with their feelings. They don't let those feelings take over, but they know the difference between a thought and a feeling. And they're able to stay rooted into that deeper kind of timeless presence.
Hello, welcome to the Happy You're Here podcast. In today's episode, we have Alex Olshonsky, aka Olo, who is a writer, businessman, yogi, and coach on a mission to spread seeds of light that have allowed him to blossom as he continues to study, celebrate, and help elevate the human experience. That sounds like a lot, Alex, and I think that you are, a very interesting guy. We've connected on Instagram originally, I think, maybe. I don't remember where we originally connected. It's one of those things you connect and then you talk for a while, and then it's like, yeah, we've been connected for a while. The thing that we're going to really dive into in this episode is masculinity and what that means as society progresses and as we evolve into new meanings of those words, and how that relates to, toxic masculinity, which some men feel a little triggered by that, and we'll talk about that. But first, every guest I ask this question: is there a tool, technique, or idea that in your journey to living a more fulfilling life has been central in helping you do that?
Well, first, thanks, Craig. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. And there is, I think, I have a big toolkit, but
Yes,
I think of all of the things, writing, I don't want to say of all the things, but writing for me has just been such a helpful process where we're so fortunate now to live in a world where we have everyone can share their ideas. And I always used to think of myself as a writer. I had lots of thoughts spinning in my head and I felt like I had something to say, but I didn't really have the courage to put it out there. And since doing that and sharing my thoughts, my ideas, my essays with a broader audience, it's truly changed my life. And it's not just the public sharing of, we all these days can essentially be our own news source and media source, but it's not really just that. It's writing is actually the process by which I figure out what the hell I know about life. And I think it's first the process through which I understand that I think I know something about it. Then I go to write about it and I'm like, I actually have no idea. And I think it was actually metamodernism, which we first connected on.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And when I first discovered metamodernism as a philosophical concept, and for those who maybe aren't familiar, it's essentially the philosophy of the internet. And when I first kind of discovered it, I was like, oh, wow, I think I get this. And then when I went to write about it, I was like, oh, this is just deeply beyond actually what I have any idea what I'm talking about. But then through writing and working and then sharing it, you get a smaller sense of the sliver. And so I think that can apply. I know you focus a lot on mental health and wellness, journaling. It doesn't have to be like a grand exercise of putting writing out there, but just a practice of taking our thought, language comprises our world, and taking our thoughts, putting it down on pen and paper or notes, and then having that as a process has been just so helpful for me.
And you made a really good point there. That doesn't have to be public sharing for everybody. Like the process of writing it out, and because it really makes you realize, like, you have all these thoughts floating around in your mind, but when you try to put them on paper or even on a computer, then you start to realize, like, oh, this isn't as coherent as I thought, or you make it coherent by writing it out. I do the same thing when I'm writing a topic, whether it's for a blog post or a guest post or something, or even something that I want to cover on the podcast if it's a solo episode, and I'll do a topic that I'm interested in, that I think I can talk about a little bit, and then I quickly realize how much I still need to research on it and learn. And I've started to use that as if I find something that it's like, oh, I really want to learn more about that, I'll schedule that as a topic that I want to talk about at some point to force myself to do the research to learn more about that specific topic.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, for we're going to be talking too about, men and masculinity. And I think for men in general, journaling as a practice, right, where it's like this, I'm talking more private, here's how I'm thinking. And for me, it's just been the practice of like, how am I feeling today? And when I go to write that every morning in my little journal, you'd be amazed by how many times like there so many things but feelings come out. And so it's really hard. I even personally struggle, like, how am I actually feeling, right? And what's in my body. And so that in itself is a super powerful practice. And then, to your point, like, I'll try to write a lot of times my writing is trying to break down intellectual ideas. And I think I get a grasp on it, and I go back and read it, a couple months later, and I'm like, man, dude, you got a long way to go.
Yeah, that's a good point too with the how men relate to journaling, because it can be such a useful tool. Some other people that I'm connected with, actually one has a whole course about journaling, and he's been doing it since 2015, 2014 or something, and it's been really big, and most of the people that are in that group are men because they don't know how to do it, because they've, I think initially when you hear journal, luckily it's become more widespread at this point, but I remember back in 2015 hearing that and thinking like a diary,
Yeah,
and it's like
right.
that's a feminine thing to do, which is kind of absurd, but it is like the apprehension that I think a lot of men, especially that are still locked in those this is what men do, this is what women do, dichotomy. It's a kind of thing that does not resonate with them until you actually try it and realize that some of the greatest men in history have journaled.
Yeah, not just journaled, but really, they had made it a practice in their life's work. And yeah, there's The Artist's Way, which I think really made, if you're familiar with that, a book that really made popular the process in the morning and that sort of practice. And then, I think it's great that in the realm of what I believe is positive psychology, like gratitude journaling, where you just simply write down, okay, here are the 5 things that I'm grateful for every day. That's becoming really popular. And yeah, and I think actually to maybe walk back what I said earlier a little bit, having a place where you can write your just that no one else sees is also so important, because as we all know in social media, our identities are often a performance of who we are.
Yeah.
And so when you're sharing stuff to write, online, that actually can, that's a pretty heady process. That is one that can be, I think, destructive if you're not very grounded kind of and centered. And so having a space where you can just unfiltered write down your thoughts, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. That's something I write in my journal all the time without realizing it. I prompt myself, what do I actually believe? Or who am I? How am I identifying right now? Which my belief is that, identity is a relatively fluid thing. So you're kind of choosing all the time what you're identifying as. But it's interesting to notice, I don't know what I believe in this regard, because I'm just regurgitating all of the things that I've been consuming and haven't taken the time to sit down and think what do I actually think,
Right. Yeah. Rene Girard has, mimetic theory, which essentially states that we're as humans, we are just copying everything that we see. And so to your point, it's so hard to distill, what ideas are actually mine, and are, even a step beyond that, are any ideas mine? Right. We have this conditioning and wiring. And so, it starts to get pretty meta and pretty almost spiritual in a certain sense, where it's where the realm of ideas, where, there's also this sense where the realm of ideas is actually a physical world enveloping our physical planet. Right. And not physical, but it's an exosphere of sorts.
Yeah.
And so, I also think about those things a lot.
Okay. Well, let's dive into, let's just kind of recap you send out a newsletter every Friday. So if anyone wants to check that out, the link to that will be in the show notes. It's all your thoughtful writing and whatever the topic is that you're covering. The one that I reached out about that I wanted to talk about on the show was the article about masculinity, the post that you made about that. So how about let's start with kind of recapping what you were talking about in that newsletter, in that article that you were writing.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Well, I think first I'd want to say that even, going into to talk about masculinity, it feels there's a little bit of, imposter syndrome, where I'm obviously, I identify as a man. And by the way, I think that it's also important to say that anything that in the way I'm talking about masculinity can be the inner qualities of masculinity, in that I think we understand that gender is fluid and has many ways we can understand it. But I think all of us in a certain sense have qualities of inner masculinity, even those who identify as women. In fact, homosexual couples are often acutely aware of the inner feminine and inner masculine qualities because of their particular dynamics.
Right.
And so what what really inspired this post was that I think, and I do a good amount of men's work, and even beyond men's work, and some of the communities I'm connected with, recently there's been a lot of talk about, tearing down the patriarchy, and especially in the wake of the Me Too movement and now coronavirus, the revolution around racism following George Floyd's death. There's a lot of talk around, how we, and a lot of awareness bubbling to the surface around how we live in this patriarchal system. And so what I was seeing was that there were two types of responses, generally speaking. One is that when men hear that, we are contributing and we are part of the patriarchy, the first response is often defensiveness.
Right.
And I think it's important to distinguish that, like true masculinity is being able to respond versus react. And, Viktor Frankl has a great quote where between stimulus and response is freedom. And so when a stimulus comes our way, we can take it in, be in our presence, be in our bodies, and then respond rather than react. And I think that oftentimes what we're seeing men, when they hear just that about the patriarchy, it's kind of like we tense up and we react, and we think in that defensiveness could be even trying to cling on to those old power systems. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we could be playing offense. And in many ways, women were the first to kind of sound the alarm. They'd be like, hey, this system's not working for us. Yeah. And we're going to work towards building a world that we want to participate in. And so I think that a man who's deeply rooted to a strong sense of inner masculinity, that inner masculinity is connected to a strength in a knowing and almost an infinite expansiveness that is not bound or related to externalities of power, right? As far as, needing to actually impose or show the power through, politics, business, whatever arena it may be. And I think that true sense of inner masculinity is expansive, and it's the opposite of toxic. And so that was kind of the inspiration where using this phrase tonic masculinity, which is the opposite of toxic.
That's the response to the idea of the patriarchy, because I think there's definitely a degree of a lot of men kind of just didn't think about it. And I think it's been, unless you are involved with like feminist circles, it's something that you're just like, I don't want to think about that, or kind of zone it out, because it's generally come along with this like attack, rightfully so, towards the patriarchy. And when you as a man associate yourself incorrectly with the patriarchy, that does not mean that attacking the patriarchy or dismantling the patriarchy does not mean attacking men or dismantling men, or even saying that men can't be in power. It's just looking at how are these systems set up that are allowing the negative traits that can be manifest in masculinity, this toxic masculine side, which, again, it's not saying that masculinity in general is toxic. There's toxic anything, and there are these traits that have a tendency to they appear in a masculine sense, and they are toxic not just to society but also to true masculinity.
I think that's a super key point, right? And that's exactly right. Where we're just because we are in the patriarchy doesn't mean that all men are patriarchal, or even that all men have oppressive qualities, right? And so just because we're within a system, like, in this, I read a great article in relation to this recently, which talks about how, like, when you're playing Monopoly, you work at acquiring real estate, and, you take pleasure in other, in greed. And in many sense, it's a great metaphor for our current system in which we live in, where, just because we're in this system doesn't mean that we are the system, right? Like, just because as myself as a white Jewish man, that doesn't mean that I'm Judaism, right? Or anything like that. And so I think that, it's a super salient point that, we have to get really clear about like what it is that we're talking about. And that, I think when we actually unpack that, like in the way that you just did, I think some men can actually be like, oh, like I can take it. Okay. Deep breath.
It's not
like,
attacking you.
Yeah. This is not about me.
Right.
And I think it's a similar, it's a separate topic, but it's a similar reaction oftentimes with what's happening with systemic racism too.
Exactly. Yeah. There is a degree of, and it's interesting because there was a post on Instagram a while ago that I commented on. I made some comments on, and then it was something about like it's okay for men to cry. Which should just be like I thought we were past that, but apparently not, because a lot of the comments were like, if you cry, you're a beta and like all this stuff. Which, first of all, the idea of like the alpha and the beta actually even in wolf society is not a thing. That is a really, really dated scientific principle that has been disproven. It only happens with wolves in captivity. It does not express itself in human society. There's like lots of evolutionary biologists that have shown that that's just not. It's not an accurate way to categorize humans. And that's where that, I think a big part of that comes from, is like, if I'm an alpha, and so a lot of people still identify by this. Right? If I'm an alpha, I have to dominate other people in order to prove that I am the alpha and I'm not being dominated. And someone said like, "Oh, well, you're just a beta." And I'm like, "I'm not, no one's an alpha to me, and I'm not an alpha to anyone else. So how does that make me a beta?" And they're like, "Well, the whole system, that whole idea but it's so pervasive."
Yeah. I think that's another really interesting point. And what it brings up for me is this other, I think, kind of thing that happened in terms of just like the greater arc of masculinity, where, if you look back at the, 50s and 60s and even 70s America, where it was just this American man was strong and silent, and they did their job. They didn't complain. They didn't cry. They didn't show emotion. And then really as a reaction to that, and as a reaction to the post-feminist movement, or the feminist movement itself, the new age man was birthed. And that man was overly sensitive, almost artificially so.
Yeah.
Hyper, maybe crying. And it was almost like a performance, right? Like we were talking about that performative identity, where it was, so far on the other, the pendulum often swings, right? And so it was so far on the other side of the spectrum that I think it actually created, it destroyed some of the polarity in that, that it can exist between these kind of charges of masculinity, inner masculinity and femininity. And so, yeah, I think that, when we talk about like this concept of tonic masculinity or non-toxic masculinity, that really is embodied. That man is embodied. That person is, in touch with their feelings. They don't let those feelings take over, but they know the difference between a thought and a feeling, and they're able to stay rooted into that deeper kind of timeless presence. And so that's what I think about when I hear about that kind of alpha beta, outdated,
Right.
thinking.
Yeah. But like, it definitely is something that a lot of people, and I think it's just an education thing of people being taught that. I just saw it on Joe Rogan's podcast. He mentioned it, and the guy that was on there was like, "That's not accurate." And
oh, really?
Joe Rogan, who has this massive audience, has been perpetuating this idea. And I mean, he's since, I've seen him correct multiple guests now on that topic. So he's like internalized that. But we've got a lot of work to do as far as education on what, and I mean, 'cause it's a nebulous thing of like what healthy, and I like the term, the tonic masculinity looks like. And as we're developing that, and as we're developing the language around that, more importantly, that is a bit of a it's not as easy as just pointing to like something and saying like that's it right there, because I think we're still in that development of it, at least from my perspective.
Totally. I mean, and from my perspective too, I think that's why, I acknowledge that I do encounter a bit of like imposter syndrome, even talking about this, something where it's like, what do I know? And I think that's where the term tonic is helpful, because to your point, it's so nebulous, and we only really have verbiage for the negative, right? The toxic masculinity. Yep. And then, unless you're doing a lot of men's work and really connected to, certain, inner development communities, you probably aren't really too familiar what that alternative vision of masculinity could look like. And so I think that you're exactly right, that like the very first step is talking about this, and in just bringing awareness and having the conversation, and just putting it in front of people, and so in getting, and being in having dialogue where it's like, I think this is where I'm at now with it, but I'm sure it will evolve, right, as we do and as our society evolves.
So on that note, what is, under your current understanding, what would you describe tonic masculinity as? Like, what traits are associated with that?
Yeah. Tonic masculinity is when a man, I think and again, when I say man, right, referring to the inner qualities, one of the benefits of masculinity is really being able to have a singular focus and a single point of purpose. And that's a very masculine quality, where it's like, I'm going to be focused on my work, or, my art, or providing for my family. And that can be a very beautiful thing. But oftentimes what happens is that awareness of consciousness is placed on the thoughts themselves. So like, in the thinking realm, in basically the realm of mental masturbation. And so that's often toxic masculinity. Tonic masculinity is taking the focal point of that awareness towards something expansive. And that expansive thing could be our bodies, it could be the universe, it could be the ocean, many different things. And so I think what comes with that is listening, responding, not reacting. Having a strength so deep that you don't need to necessarily assert yourself. It's knowing when to follow and when to lead. And I think it's embracing, the new paradigm that we're in. And so those are just a couple things that, come to mind now. I'm sure there's more to it. I'll have to reread some of the stuff that I've read from others and I've wrote. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think a really key point there is and you've said it a few times, is the respond rather than react, which is everybody experiences that, no matter what your gender is. And this is generally just like a healthy versus unhealthy way to interact with the outside world. Are you choosing to respond? And sometimes that response is no response. That response is a stoic, like, nope, not going to engage with that. But if you're reactionary, you're going to react to everything that's thrown at you. And really,
right,
we've identified that as, I think we recognize it as not strength. Like, you see a man who, like, everybody that bumps into him, he wants to start a fight with. That doesn't look like strength to anybody. No one can look at that and be like, well, that man really, he's a pillar of strength. That's a scared little puppy lashing out because it's threatened, and it thinks that's the only way that it can do that. But if you're coming from a place of strength, someone bumps into you, and it's like, you're able to assess whether that is actually a legitimate threat or not, and you're not so self-conscious that I need to, like, prove that I'm strong here. That's the big thing. Is like, do I need to prove that I'm strong, or do I just know that I'm strong? And if I know that I'm strong and I have that inner sense of strength, then I don't have anything to prove.
Yeah. That what comes up for me when you say that, and I mean it's so true. I mean, so two things. First is that with your puppy analogy, what we're also often seeing with toxic masculinity is men doing that bark, that yappy bark in the online space, where they see something that triggers them and they just react rather than sitting in and taking in. And oftentimes it's like a reaction where, it's they see something that they find to be overly sensitive, or something that they're not in touch with. And particularly when we're talking about like feminine, masculine things, they might see something that they're like, oh, that's so sensitive. I've even been guilty of this myself, rather than taking a minute to be like, okay, this person's expressing how they feel, and I'm just gonna take that in. The other thing is that I think that a quality of tonic masculinity is recognizing that having a strength so deep that, in our current world, it's been exposed that, women, they get paid less for the same jobs. They're not, you look at our government, you look at all specters of life, and it's underrepresentation. And I think that if a man is deeply rooted to their strength, they recognize that needs to change, and there very well could be a future in which women, it has flipped, right? Where women are actually in, more political roles and leading and in business. And I think that a man who is connected to a more expansive sense of strength doesn't get scared by that, but it's rather more like, let's bring that on.
Yeah, well, and that's definitely, if your reaction to the idea of representation being equal is that I'm not going to get my fair share, just take that in for a second as the audience. If my reaction to equal representation is that I'm not getting my fair share, that means your current understanding of what your share is an unfair share. And I think it's a difficult thing. I don't want to understate how difficult and kind of scary that can seem, when a way that really manifests itself, and you see this a lot with, I think, the systematic racism thing too, is like, or poverty, right? Is that someone that's a man, okay, let's just use that example, primarily masculine traits, sees that, okay, people want there to be more women in successful positions, but I'm not successful. I'm struggling as a man, right? I feel like I have even less of a chance then. Like no one's paying attention to me and my struggles. They're kind of downplaying. And the same thing happens with race, where white people that are struggling will use that as an excuse that like there's no racism. I'm also white and I'm not rich and I'm not powerful. And it's just a misunderstanding of what systematic means. It's an on average, a broad average. And obviously there are going to be lots of people that don't fit that and are still struggling in some way. But if you were a different race or a different gender and had the same exact circumstances you have now as you're struggling, your chances of your opportunity would be even less than it currently is in the current way that society's built. And I don't understand how anyone could see that and think like, well, yeah, that's how it should be.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think one of the more, bigger problems of our times. And I think it boils down to empathy, where these people have a very hard time empathizing with what other people's struggles of any shapes and varieties and structures might look like. And when you magnify that and multiply it times, an online space, a world that's moving increasingly online, where our information feeds become reality tunnels that play into our cognitive biases, and basically kind of just tell us what we want to hear within our own spectrum of political and socioeconomic kind of all realms of identity. It creates a pretty big problem. And so I think that, it's good that's why it's great you're doing something like this where you're getting a message out there. And because I think that education and awareness is probably the single most important thing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it comes down to the mindfulness of being mindful of the way that I'm relating to those identities, which is a pretty big step for a lot of our society still. It's happening, but it's like we have a long way to go. I think that I'd be interested in hearing more about like what the men's work that you do is. We're gonna like kind of start wrapping up, but what does that look like? And if someone's listening and they're like, man, I really fall into a lot of these spaces of what you're describing as toxic masculinity. Like, do you have any kind of recommendation of a starting point where someone could start to move or wants to move further in that direction of understanding what healthy masculinity could look like in their lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I do a couple different men's groups. And so I also host and organize men's retreats, and I host, group dialogues. And so I think that there's a couple different, public and free options for doing men's group, where you get together a group of guys who generally, I want to say, are conscious, where they have an intention where they want to talk and learn and grow, in each other's presence and be witnessed. And so, one of the more kind of popular and renowned ones is the Mankind Project. I think they're all over the world now. There are other new digital programs. Ronin Squad is one that I'm in, which is awesome, and I highly recommend that. And all these programs are started from folks like Robert Bly and basically folks who are very steeped in this work, right? And so I think that's key, is like when choosing a men's program is like going down a road that that there are people you can stand on the shoulders of giants, people who've been doing this work and who are brilliant. And so that's for one. And then I think that when it comes to what as a starting point, we're fortunate that there's lots of great YouTube videos out there. There's lots of great books. David Data, John Weiland, Robert Bly are all kind of Robert Bly being more the grandfather elder figure of folks, and then David Data and John Weiland being kind of his like disciple are examples of like prominent conscious masculine voices in the space today. And so I would recommend checking out those guys. Yeah, because there are great resources out there to get plugged into.
Yeah, great. That's helpful. I honestly have not heard of a few of those people, so I will follow up afterwards. I always love learning more about this kind of thing. I think also a good starting point is just being open to it, right? Like just accepting that maybe the things that you've been taught are wrong. And maybe there's room to grow. There actually is always room to grow, but that can be a big step for some people. I would hope if you're listening to this show, that's not a step that you still need to take. But if you do, that's the first step. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with? And obviously, where are some places online where you're active, where people could engage with you if they're interested?
Yeah, thanks for that, Craig. I think that what I would leave the audience with is the thing that I'm working on now. And, there's always kind of a theme, right? That, for people who are doing, I think, a lot of inner work and personal development stuff, that has been my latest kind of obsession, is really cultivating embodied presence. And so what I mean by that is, actually being in my body, fully present in the moment. And I think that's something that men, especially in a lot of respects, can use help on. It also makes them more attractive oftentimes in heteronormative and even non-heteronormative relationships to others. And so I would say that, coming into contemplative practices that allow myself to tap into, something more expansive than the world that is around us normally, especially in the midst of a global pandemic and a lot of other crazy, wild things happening, has just been so important. And I'm continuing to kind of remind myself to come back to that. And so that's the big thing that I'm working on now. Yeah, as you mentioned, I write a newsletter. It's called Fridays on the Olo. My website, ontheolo.com, has all this stuff. It has all my essays, my most popular essays. I also host group dialogues. This was actually a project that was born out of coronavirus and a need to really just process some of the existential things that we were facing. And then it really started picking up with the conversations around racism, and now it's evolving in many ways. And so there's a real digital community forming. And so would love to have other folks join that who, are just want to listen or want to have a place to talk. And that's I also do coaching, one-on-one coaching. And so kind of have a few things in the fire, working on a book. But yeah, I appreciate the
We'll have to have you back on to talk
opportunity.
about your book whenever you get closer to that.
I would love that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and all of the references that you can find Olo at are down in the
You got it.
show notes below.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, pleasure.